We sat on the bed of the old pickup truck, looking out over the town sprawled below. The sky was already painted in shades of orange and purple as the sun set, hinting at something elusive. The small town seemed frozen in time, unchanged since we all left for college. The wind pushed leaves down the empty streets, and through the windows of houses you could spot pumpkins and string lights. Halloween was just around the corner. I could feel the cold metal beneath me and the bitter taste of beer in my mouth. Sam was standing nearby, leaning against the truck bed, while Lisa swung her legs, talking about how much she had missed this town. John, my buddy from college, was also with us, his first time visiting here. Sam suddenly turned to him, his gaze slightly squinted, as if he was thinking about something long forgotten. He took a swig of his beer, then leaned on the truck bed and said, "You know, there's always been this creepy legend around here. Every Halloween, we were strictly told not to go near the town square, especially around midnight." His eyes drifted toward the old clock tower, barely visible against the fading sunset. "Over there," he nodded toward the far end of town, where the dark figure of the tower stood like a sentinel watching over time. "They say something's off with that clock. When the hands hit midnight, something strange happens. Since we were kids, they warned us. Stay away from the square on Halloween." Sam fell silent for a moment, as if trying to find the right words to describe the old anxiety buried deep in our memories. "And another thing," he continued, "never bring lit candles there. That rule was drilled into us since we were little. They said candles open the door for something ancient. When people light them on the square, they start attracting things that don't belong here. These creatures, they see the light and come like moths to a flame. Only, you can't hide from them." He looked at us, trying to add a sense of drama, but it wasn't just for effect. We'd all heard the story before, yet it always gave us chills. Sam was clearly trying to scare John. Lisa and I had heard this story a million times, but it always stirred that strange discomfort, like it wasn't just a tale to scare kids. "Yeah, right. Spooky stories." John chuckled, brushing off Sam's words like he'd told him something silly. "So all these years, none of you ever went there? You never checked it out?" He looked at us with a smile, one that had a hint of condescension. "It's just made-up stuff." We exchanged glances. There was a bit of truth in what he said. We'd never gone to the square at midnight on Halloween. For us, it was this ingrained, instinctive sense of danger, like the town itself was warning us to stay away. No matter how old we got, that feeling never faded. But now that we were older, it all seemed like nonsense. We weren't kids anymore. Maybe it was just another legend to scare the locals, to keep people from pulling dumb pranks. "What if," John continued, still smiling, "we go check it out tonight? See what really happens with your little legend?" We glanced at each other again, nervously laughing, though deep down something about the idea made us uneasy. Sam broke the silence first, his voice unexpectedly serious. "To be honest, I've always been curious about what really happens there. Maybe it's time to find out." Lisa frowned, her usual smile gone. She was always the most level-headed among us. "It's not a great idea, Sam," she said, shaking her head. "You know it's all nonsense, so why bother?" Sam began trying to convince her, and after glancing at us, she sighed and gave in. I decided to go too. Maybe the beer was getting to me, or maybe it was that strange feeling that something was about to change tonight. But deep down, I was ready. That fear that had always kept us away from the square was starting to turn into curiosity. We loaded into the pickup truck like we were heading out for just another casual night drive, but I could feel the tension hanging in the air. Sam took the wheel, and Lisa, John, and I climbed into the back, settling in. The truck rumbled to life, and we slowly rolled through the deserted yet familiar streets of our town. It was around 9 in the evening, and kids were still out and about, dressed up in bright costumes of vampires, witches, and superheroes. They laughed, knocking on doors in search of candy, their joyful shouts echoing through the evening air. Before heading to the square, we stopped at a small corner store. The shop was old, with a worn-out facade and dim lights inside. The shopkeeper, an older man with a disgruntled look on his face, barely glanced at us as we entered. We grabbed a few cans of beer and bought candles. With our purchases loaded back into the truck, we drove on. The streetlights glowed a dim yellow, and some houses were adorned with strings of pumpkin and skeleton lights. The Halloween festival was always held in the town square, not far from the clock tower. In the glow of the lights, we could see bright stalls with treats, a bobbing for apples game, mask and balloon vendors. Everywhere, garlands and pumpkin lanterns lit up the night, while the sweet smells of caramel and fried food filled the air. When we finally arrived at the square, it was still early, so we decided to walk around a bit. We wandered through the market stalls, grabbed some snacks, and just soaked in the atmosphere. Laughter and cheerful faces were everywhere. People were chatting and having a good time. But as it got closer to 11, the square started to grow quieter. People began leaving almost unnoticed at first, as if by some unspoken schedule. One by one, families gathered their kids and left the square, dragging along children who didn't want to go. One boy was crying by a market stall, clutching a bag of candy. "But I don't want to leave," he sobbed, wiping his face with his sleeve. "I want to stay." His mother looked anxious, hurriedly trying to get them out of the square. Her voice was sharp, though tinged with worry. "We can't stay here, Johnny," she said, taking his hand and pulling him away. "We have to go. Now." We sat in the pickup, watching as people gradually disappeared, one by one, as if following some ancient ritual that had always been part of life in this town. As they left, they cast quick glances at the clock tower, like something about its dark, rigid form reminded them of something they dared not forget. Even the adults, who usually dismissed the old legends we'd been told as kids, quickened their steps as they left the square. Some glanced nervously over their shoulders, as if they couldn't believe they were leaving without consequences. By 11, the square was nearly empty. Only a few vendors were packing up their stalls, the remains of the fair bathed in the dim light of the scattered street lamps. The wind had picked up, and I felt goosebumps crawl across my skin. The clock tower loomed in the darkness, barely visible, but I knew for certain its hands were inching closer to midnight. We were still laughing, though nervously. No one wanted to show fear, but with each passing minute, I felt an increasing sense of wrongness. I caught Sam, Lisa, and John glancing at each other too, and I could see they felt it too. Sam was trying to act like it was all just a bit of fun, but his jaw was tight, and his hands gripped the steering wheel a little too hard. Lisa, who usually kept the mood light, was quiet, her eyes glinting in the dim glow of the streetlights. John kept cracking jokes, but even his laughter sounded a little forced. It was 11:45, and we finally got out of the truck, trying to look calm. The square was completely deserted, as if it had been abandoned and left for dead. There was something about these local legends that really stuck with people from childhood, leaving a mark on all of us. Even John, despite his usual confidence, must have picked up on our tension, feeling it instinctively. But we considered ourselves adults, too old to believe in silly town ghost stories, so we decided to keep going. I pulled out the candles and handed one to each of the others. Sam and Lisa took theirs, hesitating slightly but without questioning it. John smirked, twirling his candle in his hand like it was some kind of party prop. We headed toward the clock tower. The dark structure loomed ahead of us, grimly watching as we approached. Against its silhouette, everything around us seemed even more eerie. The buildings faded into the night, and the tower stood like a silent witness to the years, hiding a mysterious history. We stopped in front of it, lining up like we were preparing for some ancient ritual. I glanced at my watch, 11:59. Time was still ticking. My heart was pounding, loud and steady, but I forced myself to stay still. As the clock reached the final minute, I pulled out a lighter and, trying not to show my nerves, lit each of our candles one by one. The flame was small, but its light seemed strangely warm and out of place in the eerie darkness. We stood there, candles lit, like soldiers in the face of something unknown. Honestly, I felt a little foolish. All the warnings, the stories, but that deep-seated fear, the one planted in my mind as a kid, flared up again. It was a strange feeling, a mix of shame for falling for an old-town legend and a sudden rush of terror that clawed at my mind, making me see everything differently. I glanced at the others. Sam gripped his candle so tightly that his knuckles were white. Lisa shifted uncomfortably, her eyes gleaming with tense anticipation in the candlelight. Only John stood there with his usual smirk, enjoying what he considered an absurd situation. He seemed to be waiting for us to admit this whole thing was a joke. Suddenly, the wind picked up. It hit sharply, as if out of nowhere, and almost snuffed out our candles. The flames flickered, wavered but didn't go out. And then, the first chime of the clock tower echoed through the square. A deep, resonant sound cutting through the night. Bam! We all flinched. The silence that followed was heavy, unnerving. In that moment, something shifted. I couldn't explain it. Everything just felt off. Like the world around us had tilted slightly. The candle flames began to flicker strangely, even though the wind had died down. I noticed how their light started to distort. The shadows around us lengthened, as if they were being stretched by some unseen force, moving slowly, deliberately, like they had a will of their own. Bam! The second chime. This time I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. We stood there glancing at each other, frozen in place. Something was happening around us. My eyes caught sight of mist slowly and silently creeping across the square. It was thick, almost tangible, like it was rising from the ground itself, giving the scene an even more sinister tone. Bam! Our candle flames kept burning, but their light was growing dimmer, as if being swallowed by the mist. The wind howled again, stronger this time, swirling the fog around us in spirals. A low whistle filled the air. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and the fear that had been lying dormant inside me suddenly surged forward with a force I hadn't expected. I wasn't the only one feeling it. Lisa let out a quiet gasp, and Sam nearly dropped his candle as his hands began to shake. Bam! The clock struck again, and something around us shifted. The mist thickened, flooding the square, almost engulfing it. Now it was impossible to see more than a few feet ahead, and in this milky white haze, our candles looked like small, faint dots in the vast darkness. Bam! Each strike of the clock echoed in my head, making us feel the weight of time pressing down on us. The fog kept growing denser, as if there was more and more of it, wrapping itself around us, becoming part of the strange ritual we had started. Bam! And then, finally, the 12th chime rang out. With the final strike, it was as if the clock had stopped, and the entire square plunged into a dead silence. The wind had stilled, and now the only sound was the rapid thumping of my own heart. In that moment, I realized we were about to face something terrifying. I looked around and saw that the others were pale as chalk. Even John, who had been smirking and brushing everything off, now looked frightened. He started glancing around nervously, trying to regain his composure. Well, nothing really happened, aside from the weird weather, he said, but his voice was uncertain. The fog still clung to the square, though it was slowly dissipating, like someone was turning down the settings on a fog machine. You could almost convince yourself it was some kind of prank or special effect, but we all knew. There was no one here to set it up. I glanced around again, my heart pounding in my chest. "Let's get out of here," I quietly suggested, my voice betraying my nerves. Everyone nodded quickly, agreeing with silent glances. We started heading in the direction we thought the truck was parked. We hadn't taken more than 10 steps when we heard it. A sound. A knock. It was distinct and eerie, like the sound of footsteps. But something about it felt unnatural, as if someone, or something, was approaching from deep within the square. We froze. Ahead of us, through the thinning fog, a faint light appeared. A small swinging point, moving back and forth like a pendulum. Lisa gasped and hid behind me, clutching tightly to my jacket. "It's someone with a lantern," John said, trying to sound confident, but even his voice held a note of fear. We all huddled closer together, like a herd sensing the approach of a predator. The figure kept coming closer, the light growing brighter. And when it finally got near enough, we saw it. It was a person. No, more like something that resembled a person. He was dressed in an old-fashioned suit, a tailcoat that looked like it belonged to the Victorian era. Beneath a dark hat, hair framed his face, but instead of a head, he had a carved pumpkin. A huge pumpkin with jagged eyes and a mouth, but there were no candles inside. Instead, something strange, something unearthly glowed within it. Not a flame, but something alive, as if the being itself was radiating light. In one hand, it held a long cane, and in the other, an old kerosene lantern, the light from which swayed unnaturally with each step. His feet were clad in wooden shoes, and the sound they made was the very noise we had heard. I blinked, struggling to believe what I was seeing. It felt unreal. I tried to convince myself it was some kind of prank, maybe a costumed actor or a master of special effects. But as this figure drew closer, I felt something deeper. This was more than a trick. This was real. And the realization made my knees feel weak, as if I had stepped into a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Behind me, Lisa let out a quiet sob. John stood frozen, his usual self-assurance completely vanished, replaced by the same icy dread that gripped us all. Sam was silent, his eyes locked on the strange being that was slowly walking past us, its footsteps echoing across the empty square. As it came level with us, things got even worse. The creature stopped abruptly and turned its pumpkin head in our direction. Its hollow, jagged eyes seemed to pierce straight into my soul. At that moment, I felt pure, cold terror flood through me. My voice wouldn't work. My legs wouldn't move. and then it laughed. Loud, raspy, and terrible, like the sound of something not human, but from another realm. The laugh echoed through the square, bouncing off the buildings. My fear reached its peak as the figure raised its cane and tipped its hat, holding it out in front of us like it was offering a formal greeting. It bowed to us, deeply, like a gentleman at a masquerade, then slowly placed the hat back on its pumpkin head, as if we were merely guests in its world, and it had decided to greet us. We stood there, rooted in place, watching this bizarre ritual unfold. The creature said nothing, made no threatening moves. It simply continued on its way, as if nothing had happened. I couldn't believe my eyes. What was this? Why did it happen? When it finally disappeared into the fog, my legs began to shake. We stood there for a few more seconds, trying to process what we had just witnessed. What was this pumpkin-headed creature, and why hadn't it harmed us? I looked at the others. They were all in shock, their eyes wide, faces pale. "What was that?" Sam whispered, barely able to get the words out. But none of us had an answer. Were the old legends true? What the hell had I gotten myself into? I cursed myself, feeling panic surge through me, but standing still wasn't an option. We had to act. We ran for the truck, our legs barely responding, but fear was pushing us forward. I jumped into the driver's seat, my hands shaking as I shoved the key into the ignition. I turned it. Silence. The engine wouldn't start. Damn it. Come on, start it," Lisa whimpered, her voice trembling. I turned the key again. Nothing. My whole body tensed, my heart pounding in my throat. What now? Suddenly I heard a strange noise. A low, muffled growl, as if something was standing next to the truck, slowly, almost imperceptibly, approaching. We froze in the car, barely daring to breathe. The fog had almost cleared, but there was still enough around the edges of the square to obscure parts of the scene. And that's when I saw something that made my blood turn to ice. Silhouettes. They looked human, but not quite. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. And when my eyes focused, I realized they were werewolves. Their bodies resembled human forms, but with long claws and jaws that were half beast-like. And their heads? They were wolf heads, distorted and grotesque, with eyes glowing with a ghastly light. I blinked and rubbed my eyes, hoping it was just a trick of the fog. But those creatures didn't vanish. They weren't illusions. They were slowly materializing, as if forming from the shadows and mist, their shapes becoming more solid, more real. One of them, towering above the rest, sniffed the air, like a predator searching for prey. Another quietly leapt down from the roof of a nearby building, and now their dark figures seemed to be surrounding us from all sides. I glanced at my friends. Sam sat in the back, arms crossed tightly over his chest, his eyes squeezed shut. His lips were moving, whispering something over and over like a mantra. "It's just a dream. Just a dream." Lisa was next to him, her hands trembling, her eyes shimmering with tears. She was scared to death. John, who had looked so confident before, was now as pale as a ghost. His lips were quivering, and it was clear he was cursing himself for suggesting we come here in the first place. The truck wasn't starting, and these creatures were closing in. I realized that if we didn't leave now, it might be too late. Taking a deep breath, I quietly opened the door and, turning to my friends, whispered, "Follow me, quietly." We crouched and began to slip out of the truck, moving as silently as we could to avoid drawing attention. The tension was thick, broken only by the occasional sound of our feet on the pavement. The werewolves, it seemed, hadn't noticed us yet. They were still circling the edges of the square, sniffing and growling to themselves. One of them suddenly stopped, as if it had caught a scent, but then it continued moving in the opposite direction. We moved slowly, inching our way off the square. Every step felt like an eternity. The creatures continued to stalk the area, and I feared that at any moment one of them would turn and spot us. My heart was beating so loud it felt like it could be heard from miles away. The werewolves kept moving, but luckily they hadn't noticed us yet. Once we were beyond the square, I risked a glance back. The creatures were still there, but they no longer seemed to be looking in our direction. It felt like we had escaped. But something inside me told me the danger wasn't over yet. We made our way down the empty street, and with each step, the feeling that something was terribly wrong with the town grew stronger. It was impossible to ignore. The air itself felt thicker, colder, as if it was closing in around us. We needed help, but when I checked my phone, the screen remained dark. No signal. Not even that surprised me anymore, but it terrified me nonetheless. Panic was rising inside me like a wave, and I couldn't suppress it. I looked toward the nearest house, hoping for some sign of life. There was a light on in the window, and for a moment I felt a flicker of hope. But as I got closer and peered inside, my heart skipped a beat. Instead of people, I saw shadowy figures moving aimlessly around the house. Their movements were slow and unnatural, as if they were cursed or not entirely real. "Damn," I whispered. "What is this?" We rushed to the next house. I looked through the window, expecting to see something different, but it was the same scene. Shadows wandering inside, like ghosts trapped in a parallel world. Panic surged through me even more. I began running from one house to the next, trying to figure out what was going on, but every time it was the same. This wasn't our world, or at least it wasn't fully ours. Had we crossed into another dimension? Were we stuck in some nightmare where reality had blended with the horrors we'd only ever heard about in stories? But now they were real. I didn't know what to think anymore. We stopped in the middle of the street, our hearts pounding, breaths ragged. We tried to come up with a plan, but no one had any ideas. We were in a world where there was no one to ask for help, and it felt hostile. Maybe we needed to go back to the square and relight the candles. Maybe it had something to do with the ritual we started but didn't finish. But those creatures were still there. As we debated what to do next, I heard the sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. A familiar growl. It came from the darkness. I spun around, my eyes widening in horror. One of the creatures was perched on a nearby rooftop watching us. It was crouched low, its glowing eyes fixed on our every move. My heart raced even faster. I quickly scanned the surroundings and realized we were surrounded. In the bushes nearby, I spotted another one of the creatures. It was hiding in the shadows, but I could see its wary gaze fixed on us. Another werewolf peeked out from behind a house, its claws scraping the wall as it watched us intently. "Don't make any sudden moves," I whispered to my friends, trying to keep my voice steady. We all froze, but the creatures seemed to sense that we had spotted them. Their behavior shifted instantly. The werewolf on the rooftop growled louder, its eyes glowing even brighter, and within seconds it leaped off the roof, lunging toward us. It was like a signal to the others. The ones who had been hiding also began to move. They charged at us, their claws scraping the ground, their growls growing louder. We reacted instantly. Adrenaline kicked in, and we sprinted down the street, away from the monsters. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear anything except the clatter of claws on the pavement and our ragged breathing. "Faster!" I shouted, glancing back at my friends. We ran down the street, feeling those creatures closing in on us, their presence looming like an inevitable shadow. My pulse thundered in my ears, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. Ahead, I spotted an old house, the Lewis house. I knew the place well. The Lewis family had moved out of town years ago, and since then, the house had stood abandoned, neglected, as if it had been forgotten by time. Then, as if by some miracle, the front door slowly creaked open. Standing in the doorway was a little girl in a white nightgown. In the midst of all this horror, she seemed like a beacon of normalcy, strangely calm and serene. She silently waved her hand, as if inviting us inside, like salvation was just beyond that threshold. I didn't have time to think. The creatures were too close. I made a decision. "In the house!" I shouted, and we veered off the street, making a mad dash toward the Lewis house. The girl stepped back, and we rushed inside, slamming the door behind us. I expected the creatures to immediately start scratching at the door, their claws tearing at the wood. But instead, there was only silence. An eerie, oppressive silence hung over everything outside. Had we really escaped? I moved cautiously to the window, peering out, and my heart skipped a beat. There was no one. The werewolves were nowhere to be seen. We stood in a narrow hallway, all of us gasping for breath, our bodies still reeling from the mad sprint. No one spoke. We were a mess, exhausted, terrified, and on the brink of collapse. I was close to breaking down myself. What now? My mind was a complete blank. Then I remembered the girl. Slowly, I turned to look at her. She stood in the corner of the hallway, quietly watching us. She couldn't have been more than 5 years old, maybe younger. Her white nightgown hung down to her feet, and she was barefoot, clutching a worn teddy bear. Her large, innocent eyes gazed at me with curiosity. At first glance, she seemed like an ordinary child, but a chill ran down my spine. There was something off about her, something unsettling, like she was part of something much more sinister. The whole scene felt like it was ripped from a cheap horror movie. I swallowed hard and, mustering up my courage, asked, "What's going on here? How did you get here?" She didn't answer. Instead, the girl slowly turned and walked toward a room at the back of the house. Just before disappearing into the darkness, she paused and looked back at us, nodding slightly as if inviting us to follow her. We exchanged uneasy glances, tension gripping each of us. Sam looked like he was on the verge of bolting, but no one said a word. Despite the gnawing fear, we decided to follow her. We moved cautiously down the dark hallway and entered the living room. The room was old and run down, with peeling wallpaper and furniture covered in dust. In the center of the room stood the girl, as if waiting for us. Scattered around her on the floor were small dolls made from old white socks. These dolls were crudely sewn, with black eyes and mouths drawn on them. They looked eerie and unnatural, as if made by someone who didn't quite understand what real people looked like. The dolls lay in various positions across the floor, but the most unsettling thing was that it felt like they were watching us. Motionless, yet their black painted eyes seemed to track our every move, like they were part of some ancient, unknowable ritual. The girl stood in the middle of this scene, her white nightgown faintly glowing in the dim light of a flickering lamp. She didn't speak, just stood there among her creepy dolls, like the little mistress of this strange, unnerving world. We stood in the living room, unsure of what to do next. The whole situation was getting stranger by the minute. and the tension in the room was palpable. I could feel the silence pressing down on us, and no one dared to break it. Suddenly, Lisa whispered softly, "Isn't this the Lewis's house? I remember they had a little girl who died. That's why they moved away." Those words cut through the silence like a cold blade. We all exchanged glances, and in each other's eyes, I saw the same fear that was gripping me. The girl standing in the middle of the room, surrounded by her creepy dolls, no longer seemed like just a child. She was something else, something far more terrifying. I turned to her again. Her eyes were still innocent, like any regular child's, but now that innocence felt fake, like an ill-fitting mask. We froze, not knowing what to do. And then, something happened that none of us could have expected. The dolls scattered around the room began growing. Their sock bodies slowly stretched and expanded right before our eyes. It was like some twisted performance, where the dolls came to life, as if obeying some hidden force. They kept growing, soon resembling the same girl who stood in the middle of the room, but their faces were distorted and doll-like, with grotesque grimaces and empty eyes. Some of them were laughing, others sneering as if mocking us. I saw their mouths begin to open, revealing tiny, sharp teeth that glinted in the dim light. The dolls started moving, swaying side to side like marionettes on strings. And then the girl spoke her first words. "Play with me." Damn it. It was such a cliché that I couldn't believe my ears. If I had been watching a movie, I would have laughed at this moment. But this was happening right in front of me, and laughter was the last thing on my mind. I felt cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. I turned to Sam, who was standing behind me, and gave him a signal with my elbow. We needed to get out of here. Right now. He understood without words and nodded. We started backing away, moving slowly, but as soon as I took a step, one of the dolls, the one closest to me, suddenly leaped and bit into my arm with its sharp teeth. I felt a sudden, sharp pain like needles piercing my skin. I screamed and started shaking my arm desperately, trying to fling the thing off. It was small, but strong, its teeth digging into my flesh, refusing to let go. "Run!" I shouted, nearly choking on my own panic. We bolted from the room, the creatures jumping after us, their small but terrifying figures bouncing, trying to grab onto our legs, arms, anything they could. It was like they were getting faster. But I knew there might be werewolves waiting for us at the exit, and the risk was too high. "Head for the back door!" I yelled, hoping it might somehow save us. We rushed toward the back exit, jumping over furniture like it was some kind of hellish maze. One of the dolls was still clinging to my arm, its teeth sinking deeper, and I could feel its jaws filling with my blood. In desperation, I swung my arm so hard that I finally tore it off. It flew against the wall, and I saw blood on the sleeve of my jacket. The pain was unbearable, but there was no time to think about it. We burst through the back door and into a small yard that bordered another house. I looked back and saw the girl standing on the porch of her house. She wasn't chasing us, but her dolls stood beside her, swaying as if in sync with some invisible rhythm. Damn. I exhaled, still unable to believe what I had just witnessed. The others stopped as well, unsure of what to do. We barely managed to scramble over a small fence separating us from the neighboring yard and kept running. I looked back once more and saw the girl still standing on the porch, calm, as if nothing had happened. Her dolls, all with those grotesque grimaces on their faces, seemed to be watching us, but they didn't move. We stopped for a moment to catch our breath. I rolled up my jacket sleeve and saw deep bite marks left by the tiny teeth. Blood was seeping out, and the pain stabbed through me again. This was real. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't an illusion. We were trapped in a nightmare, and we didn't know how to escape it. But one thing was clear. We had to keep moving before this town destroyed us. We kept walking, not knowing where to go. Damn, I had no idea what to do, but standing still was definitely the worst idea. The pain in my arm throbbed, but it was the best reminder that we had to keep moving. We walked down streets that felt increasingly foreign, as if the town I'd lived in all my life had suddenly turned into something strange, eerie, and unfamiliar. Soon we reached a wide street and I stopped. I had lived here for years, but I didn't remember this street. It was weird, like it had never existed before. We walked a bit further, maybe a quarter of a mile, when suddenly a bright glowing sign appeared, illuminating the dark street. It read, "The Rolling Bar." "The Rolling Bar?" I muttered, confused about what that even meant. The name seemed ridiculous, like this place should be mobile, but it was actually just a regular old building that housed a bar. We exchanged glances, scared and exhausted. None of us knew what to do next. My heart was pounding faster, and I made a decision. "I'll go check it out," I said. "Maybe there are normal people inside." Cautiously, I approached the door and placed my hand on the handle. The door was heavier than I expected, and when I pushed it, there was a creak, as if it hadn't been opened in a long time. From inside, I could hear music, muffled, distant notes of old jazz, sounding like it was from a different era. It was an ordinary tune, but in this context, it felt completely out of place. I stepped inside. At first glance, it seemed like a regular bar. Old-fashioned wooden tables and chairs, dim lighting casting shadows on the walls. The bar counter was lined with dark wood, and shelves behind it held rows of liquor bottles. Everything looked normal as it could in this nightmare. Even the music playing from an old phonograph in the corner gave the place a retro vibe that, at any other time, might have seemed cozy. But after a few seconds, I noticed one detail that sent a chill down my spine. Seated at the tables were skeletons. Real, human skeletons, dressed in old-fashioned suits and dresses, as if the people who had once been here decided to stay forever. They sat at their tables, slumped in their chairs, holding glasses of liquor. Some were talking to each other, but it wasn't speech. It was more like the rustling of dry bones brushing against each other. I froze in place. My heart seemed to stop for a moment, and all I could feel was pure, cold fear. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. They weren't just sitting there, they were alive, if you could even call it that. I watched as one of them raised a glass to where his jaw used to be, and another leaned toward his neighbor as if whispering something, though he had no lips, only an empty skull staring blankly ahead. My body locked up. My legs refused to move. I tried to gather my thoughts, but the only thing running through my mind was, what the hell is happening here? I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. Everything inside me screamed that I needed to get out of there immediately. Suddenly, I heard my friends' voices outside. Something was wrong. I turned around, but before I could react, they stumbled into the bar, their faces pale as if they had just seen something horrific. Behind them stood two massive skeletons dressed in old, worn-out suits. They looked like thugs, bouncers for this place. Each of them held a large club, as if ready to use them at any moment. My friends' faces were filled with fear, and they seemed to expect the worst. The silence that had hung in the bar was shattered. The noise drew the attention of the other patrons. All the skeletons sitting at their tables suddenly froze and turned their empty gazes toward us. They began muttering something unintelligible, but the general meaning was clear. Humans. Humans are here, they whispered, their voices sounding like the rustling of dry bones. These creepy beings began slowly rising from their seats. They surrounded us, their empty eye sockets fixed on us with an unsettling interest, as if we were strange creatures trapped in a cage. We found ourselves in the middle of the bar, surrounded by the dead, who were clearly plotting something. I couldn't figure out what they wanted. Did they intend to kill us? Eat us? Or did they have even darker plans? A skeleton in an old-fashioned hat with faded ribbons on his sleeves slowly approached us. He looked older than the others, if a skeleton could even appear old. There was something regal yet terrifying in his movements, like an ancient judge coming to deliver a verdict. Lost little ones wandering into such a scary place, he rasped in a creaky voice. His jaw clicked slightly as he spoke, and his empty eye sockets seemed to pierce right through us. Well, I can help you find your way out. But, as you've learned in your short lives, nothing is free. Let's play a game. If you win, I'll tell you how to get out of here. But if you lose, your soul will become ours. Those words hit like a hammer on an anvil. We huddled together as much as we could, pressing close. No one dared breathe loudly, but the panic inside us grew stronger. We whispered to each other, unsure of what to do. It was a crazy situation, one that seemed to have no escape. I looked at the skeleton, trying to find even the slightest hint of compassion or deceit in his expression. But there was nothing. Just cold, empty eye sockets and a clicking jaw. "What kind of game?" I asked, unable to stop my voice from trembling. The skeleton grinned, baring its teeth in a horrifying mockery of a smile. "Just a game of poker," he replied, as if it was the most ordinary thing. In his bony hands, I noticed a deck of cards, which he shuffled with an eerie skill that seemed out of place for a creature without muscles. John stepped forward, his voice strained but firm. "I'm pretty good at poker. And it seems like we don't have a choice," he said, barely holding back his panic. I turned to the skeleton. "And if we refuse, can we just leave?" I asked, hoping it was all just a bluff. The skeleton grinned again. "Of course," he answered slowly, savoring each word. "You can leave right now, but I can't guarantee you'll make it out alive." His words felt like a threat, too clear to be misunderstood. He was hinting that the door we could flee through wouldn't lead to safety, but to an even more terrifying end. John stepped forward again, this time with determination in his eyes. "I'll play," he said, taking a deep breath. John sat at the table across from the skeleton, his face a mixture of concentration and fear. We huddled behind him, feeling the tension in the air reach its peak. The skeleton shuffled the cards slowly, its bony fingers moving deftly, as if it had been doing this for centuries. Chips appeared on the table, and the first round began. John glanced at his cards and placed his first bet. I knew he was a good player, but this game wasn't just about luck. It was for our souls. The skeleton, without saying a word, matched the bet, laying chips on the table. The silence in the bar was unbearable. Even the other skeletons were still, watching intently. The first round started cautiously. John was nervous, but trying not to show it. His hands trembled slightly, but his eyes stayed locked on the cards and chips, as if he was trying to read something beyond the numbers. He made his next bet, more confidently this time. The skeleton stared at John as though trying to read his mind. Then it placed its chips on the table. It seemed like they were playing a silent game, testing each other's resolve. Finally, the moment came to reveal the cards. John showed his hand. 2 pairs, kings and jacks. We all exhaled in relief. A solid combination. The skeleton, however, revealed a 3 and a 7. A useless hand. John won the first round and a slight smile appeared on his face. It gave us a flicker of hope, but we knew this was just the beginning. "Beginner's luck," the skeleton rasped, its empty eye socket still fixed on John. The second round began. The skeleton shuffled the cards again, its movements eerily precise. John picked up his cards and immediately frowned. This time he didn't like what he saw. I could see the tension in his face and his hands shook a little more. He placed a cautious bet, clearly hoping the skeleton wouldn't raise. But the skeleton, sensing John's weakness, raised the bet without hesitation. John hesitated but matched the raise, pushing his chips forward. We watched in horror as the stakes climbed, and it was clear that John wasn't confident in his hand. "Well, boy," the skeleton hissed, baring its teeth in a grotesque grin. "Ready to lose?" John nodded silently, deciding to continue, though his face showed anxiety. He revealed his cards, a pair of 8s, a weak hand, and I immediately knew something was wrong. The skeleton, still grinning, laid down its cards. 3 10s. Damn, that was a strong hand. It won the second round. "Ha!" The skeleton let out a raspy laugh that echoed through the bar. Sometimes the dead get lucky too. Now the situation was tense. The skeleton had the upper hand, and fear once again settled on our faces. The bar fell into a heavy silence. John wiped the sweat from his forehead, trying to collect his thoughts. We were all on edge, knowing everything would be decided in the third round. The skeleton shuffled the cards for the final hand. John sat on pins and needles, and I could feel his tension spreading to the rest of us. This round was our last chance. When the cards were dealt, John slowly picked them up. For a moment his face was unreadable, but then I saw a faint glimmer of hope in his eyes. He quickly hid it, not wanting to give the skeleton any clues about his hand. The skeleton remained as calm and confident as ever. It made the first bet, and it was high. John looked at his cards and responded without hesitation. This was an all-or-nothing game. The skeleton raised the stakes again, and John accepted, unwavering. Everything came down to this. First, the skeleton revealed its cards, a pair of 9s. Not a bad hand, but not strong enough to be a game winner. I could feel adrenaline surging. Everything now depended on John. John slowly laid his cards on the table. His hand was steady, and I could see the fear fading from his face. He turned them over. He had a straight, an incredible hand. We all held our breath as we realized John had won. He exhaled in relief, as if an enormous weight had been lifted off his shoulders. The skeleton grinned, its hollow eye sockets locking onto us once again. "That was a good game," it rasped. "I think when you die, we can continue." After saying that, it let out a dry, raspy laugh, like metal scraping against stone. But then it abruptly fell silent, and its voice became cold and eerily calm again. "You may go. If you head further down the street, take a right, then another left, you'll reach the old clockmaker. He'll help you. With those words, the skeleton stood, its movements sharp and brittle, and headed for the exit, dissolving into the shadows. We were left in the bar, unsure of what to do. But finally, someone made a move. I hesitantly stepped toward the door, and the skeletons around us began to part slowly, as if clearing a path. Their empty eye sockets still fixed on us, but they no longer moved, as if their interest in us had faded. We cautiously stepped out of the bar and found ourselves back on the street. There was a sense of relief, but it was accompanied by a lingering unease, the feeling that we were still being watched. Regardless, standing still was foolish. We exchanged glances, silently agreeing that running was our best option, and so we bolted. We ran through the empty streets, past old houses and dark alleys, following the skeleton's directions. The silence in this town was unnerving, broken only by the sounds of our footsteps and ragged breathing. We turned right, then left, as instructed. And, to our surprise, the skeleton hadn't lied. Ahead of us appeared a building with large display windows filled with clocks. It was strange, but also somehow calming. The time on the clocks seemed eternal, as if frozen. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves, and pulled the door open. A small bell chimed, announcing our arrival. Inside it was quiet, the dim light illuminated by kerosene lamps. The air was thick with the smell of oil and aged wood. Behind the counter, hunched over a disassembled clock, sat a man in simple clothing, a worn shirt and vest, with a magnifying lens perched over one eye. He was meticulously repairing the clock, his movements precise like those of a surgeon. For a moment, it seemed like he hadn't even noticed us. We cautiously approached the counter, and when the man finally lifted his head, his expression showed no surprise. It was as if the arrival of lost souls at this strange hour was something entirely normal for him. "Is everything all right?" he asked with a slight smile, though his voice carried a hint of concern. Seeing a normal person standing before us made us all want to cry with relief. Everything had been so bizarre that normalcy now felt like a miracle. I could see tears rolling down Lisa's cheeks, and I was struggling to hold back my own emotions. The man, noticing the blood on my sleeve, silently stood and went into a back room. A few moments later, he returned with a bandage and a piece of clean cloth. He quickly and expertly bandaged my arm, his movements swift and confident, as if he had done this many times before. The pain dulled a bit, but the weight of everything that had happened still pressed heavily on me. The man glanced up at the clock hanging on the wall. It read around 4 a.m. Unable to bear the tension any longer, I blurted out, "Who are you?" The man smiled, his eyes glinting in the dim light of the lamps. "I'm the one the town's founders left behind. My job is to help lost souls like yourselves find a way out of here." "So, there have been others?" I asked, surprised. "Of course," the man nodded. "There are always people who want to break the rules. That's why I'm here. I give them a chance to return, though not all make it." "But what is this place?" Lisa interrupted, her voice trembling. The man sighed and began to explain. "It's an old story. When your ancestors built this town, they quickly realized something was wrong with this place. Strange things happened here. So they summoned a medium who told them that this land had a hole, a rift between the world of the living and the world beyond. When this rift was opened, terrible things began to occur in the town. Disappearances, illnesses, strange phenomena. The founders knew they had to do something, so they decided to create a barrier, a tower that could contain this power. That tower is the clock tower you see. But every Halloween, when the forces beyond grow stronger, the barrier weakens. The tower still works, but its power isn't absolute. That's why lighting candles is forbidden. It attracts spirits and disrupts the barrier, pulling you into this realm. As I listened, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, but it all seemed too incredible to believe. The man continued, "But those same spirits can also send you back. The only way to escape is to reach the tower before sunrise. Listen carefully. You must climb to the very top, to the clock itself. There's a lock, and I'll give you the key. You must turn it, and only then can you return." He handed me a small copper key. I took it, feeling the cold metal in my hand. It was a simple key, but I knew it held something far more complex and dangerous. "You don't have much time," the man added, his voice growing serious. "Hurry. Dawn is approaching." We thanked him and quickly made our way to the exit, bursting out onto the street. We burst onto the street and a cold wind hit my face. Time was running out, but with each step, it felt like it was crawling by, painfully slow. We ran through the narrow streets, weaving between abandoned houses and dark alleys. I kept glancing around, expecting to see another creature or the werewolves that had chased us earlier. My heart was pounding so loud it felt like it echoed across the entire street. Then, we reached the main road leading straight to the square with the clock tower. But instead of relief at seeing our goal, I froze, and chills ran down my spine. What lay before us was a terrifying, grotesque sight. Down the street, right toward the square, a procession was moving. It was a carnival, but not the kind you'd imagine at festivals or in movies. This was something completely different. Horrific. Twisted. Like someone had gathered the worst creatures from nightmares and paraded them in front of us. At the front were towering figures, humanoid but with elongated, misshapen bodies, their jaws unnaturally long and sharp. Their eyes glowed like predators in the night, and their skin was gray and wrinkled as if they had been dead for centuries. Behind them slouched grotesque figures resembling werewolves but with human faces, their long arms ending in claws as sharp as blades. Here and there, creatures resembling giant spiders crawled along, each with a human head that swiveled and clicked its teeth, as if devouring some invisible prey. All of this was accompanied by the sounds of dreadful instruments, rusty trumpets and warped drums producing dull nasal sounds that bored straight into your brain. This carnival wasn't just eerie, it was a living nightmare, the embodiment of every fear I had ever felt. We all stood there, frozen in place, unable to tear our eyes away from this sinister parade. I felt cold sweat running down my back. My friends were also paralyzed, unsure of what to do. We didn't have time to think, but the procession was so overwhelming that we simply couldn't move. Suddenly, one of the creatures, a huge figure with long claws and horns, noticed us. Its yellow eyes glowed brighter, and it stopped dead in its tracks, staring directly at us. It raised a clawed hand and let out a long, roaring scream that echoed through the streets. "Humans!" it bellowed. That scream rippled through the entire procession, and the other creatures began to turn. Their deranged faces twisted into terrifying grimaces, and the rows of monsters started to move faster, heading straight for us. "Run!" I yelled, and we bolted. We ran without looking back, but I could hear the creatures starting the chase. Their heavy footsteps, roars, and the scraping of claws on the asphalt grew closer and closer. The whole street came alive with nightmarish sounds and movement. These monsters seemed to fill every corner of the road, and I felt terror swallowing me whole. We ran as fast as we could, feet pounding against the stony sidewalks, past crumbling houses and empty streets. getting closer to the square. My heart pounded in my chest and my breathing was ragged. It felt like my legs were about to give out, but I knew. If we stopped, they'd catch us, and then nothing could save us. We neared the square, knowing the creatures from the carnival were waiting for us, and the chase behind was closing in. My mind was racing, desperately trying to come up with a way to get us out of this nightmare. Then I noticed the oil lamps hanging on posts along the square, their dim light cutting through the foggy night. I grabbed a nearby stick, quickly shrugged off my jacket, and wrapped it around the stick. Without hesitation, I tore down one of the lamps and carefully poured the oil onto the jacket. It only took a few seconds. We kept running, but the delay had allowed the creatures to get closer. The carnival monsters were right behind us now, their footsteps and growls growing louder. As we reached the square, werewolves leapt out of the fog toward us. Their claws glistened in the streetlights, and their yellow eyes burned in the darkness. I didn't hesitate. I pulled out my lighter and ignited the jacket, which flared up instantly, blinding me for a moment. I began swinging the flaming stick in front of me like a fiery shield. The werewolves immediately stopped, snarling and retreating, clearly afraid of the fire. "This is our chance!" I shouted, and we dashed toward the tower. I kept waving the burning stick, holding the creatures at bay. The flames were dying down, but it was enough to keep the monsters from attacking. We reached the tower, and luckily, the door was unlocked. Without thinking, we burst inside. "Shut it!" Lisa yelled, and John and I threw our weight against the heavy wooden door, slamming it shut with a deafening crash. The door closed, but I knew it wouldn't hold for long. These creatures were too strong. We ran up the narrow spiral staircase leading to the top. Every step echoed off the stone walls, and behind us, we could hear the dull thuds. The monsters were already breaking down the door. My heart pounded, each step matching the frantic beating in my head. The staircase felt endless. I could hear the scraping of claws against the stone walls. Something or someone was climbing the tower from the outside. I caught a glimpse of a shadow passing by the window, and it filled me with even more dread. We kept climbing, our breathing labored, our legs heavy with exhaustion, but we couldn't stop. Below, the door began to crack, the creatures nearly through. When we finally reached the top, we found ourselves in the clock room. The massive clock mechanism ticked with a deep rhythmic sound, filling the space with the metallic clanking of gears. The turning cogs and wheels moved in perfect harmony, but now we needed to find the keyhole. Time was running out. I scanned the mechanism, frantically searching for a lock or a place to insert the key. Then, I spotted a small panel hidden behind one of the gears. It looked like it had been forgotten or deliberately concealed. Getting closer, I saw it was sealed with a small copper lock. This was the place. "There, over here!" I shouted, pointing it out to my friends. I pulled out the key the clockmaker had given us and inserted it into the lock. For a second, my heart stopped. What if it didn't work? But as I turned the key, I heard a satisfying click, and the enormous gears of the clock mechanism slowed for a moment before resuming their rhythm with renewed force. The clock's chimes rang out with a deafening boom. At that exact moment, the door below shattered, and the creatures stormed into the tower. We could hear their roars, but outside the window, the first rays of dawn were already beginning to shine. A gust of wind suddenly howled outside, like someone had exhaled forcefully from another world, but just as quickly it fell silent. The storm of terror that had chased us, the noise from outside, it all vanished. Everything became eerily quiet. I looked at the keyhole where the key had been, but it was gone, as if it had dissolved, just like all the horrors that had hunted us through the night. We exchanged glances, still in disbelief that it had really worked. The fear slowly began to give way to cautious hope. "It's time to head down," I said quietly. We carefully descended the same spiral staircase, where just moments before we had heard the pounding and howling of the monsters. Our footsteps echoed off the cold stone walls, but now the silence filled the entire tower. I could feel the tension easing with each step, though it was hard to fully accept that this nightmare was over. When we reached the door, to our astonishment, it was intact. The door the monsters had almost torn apart was now perfectly whole, as if no one had ever tried to break through. It was surreal, like the entire night had been a dream that was now fading with the daylight. We stepped out onto the square, and the morning sun's rays slowly began to warm the city. The square was empty and peaceful. There were no signs of the terrible creatures, no monsters, no trace of the horror that had unfolded here just hours ago. It seemed like the city had come back to life with the first light of dawn. Everything looked completely normal, but I knew it hadn't been a dream. The deep wound on my arm, the bite from that creepy doll, and the dried blood on my bandage were proof enough. I looked down at it, and a chill ran through me. Everything that had happened that night was real. We stood on the empty square, looking around. No sounds, no movement. Only the quiet morning breeze brushing against our faces. Lisa, Sam, and John also looked around in silence, clearly trying to process the fact that we had survived.